Says it's ready to mercilessly strike and blames the U.S. for driving the two countries to the brink of nuclear war.
CNN international correspondent Paula Hancock is in Seoul. Paula, of course, this threat comes just hours ahead of joint drills with South Korea. Is that what sparked the warning?
Well, Victor and Christy, this is certainly expected from North Korea. We have these joint drills between the U.S. and South Korea starting on Monday, and they'll last 10 days. Ulchi Freedom Guardian, they're called. They happen every year, and the U.S. says they are defensive in nature, but quite frankly, North Korea doesn't see them that way. Any military drills they see as a practice for an invasion of North Korea, and this is exactly what they're seeing this time as well. They say that it's a reckless provocation to carry out this, and also reminding the U.S. That as far as North Korea is concerned, they can already hit Guam, Hawaii and mainland United States. So certainly we're seeing an increase in the rhetoric. It is to be expected, though, as those drills are about to start. One interesting thing about these drills is they are a computer simulation. So you're not going to see thousands of U.S. Marines landing on a South Korean beach like you do in the spring drills, a massive amphibious landing, live fire drills, which are a provocation, North Korea says, for them to see that, thinking that's an attempt to practice for war. Potentially, tensions won't be quite as high now, considering you won't be seeing these pictures, but obviously we started from a higher level. We know that the head of the U.S. Pacific Command, Admiral Harry Harris, is here in Seoul right now. He has met with the South Korean Defense Minister to try and figure out how to coordinate better in order to deal with North Korea and potentially to oversee these drills as well. Victor, Christy, back to you.
All right, Paula Hancock, thank you so much for the update.
Now, as North Korea is issuing these new threats, President Trump, is returning to Washington today to a freshly renovated White House. And, you know, it has been an eventful working vacation, to say the very least, for the president.
Yeah, this morning we want to take stock of really what's happened since the president left a little more than 2 weeks ago. First, the president threatened nuclear war with North Korea, remember, with his fire and fury comment. He blamed many sides for the violence in Charlottesville, which included an act of domestic terror by a neo-Nazi. And he then doubled down on that idea, saying there were, quote, many fine people among the white supremacists and KKK marchers.
And the fallout from those comments led business allies to abandon his business councils, although President Trump then tweeted it was his idea to shut them down. Well, after another terror attack, this time in Barcelona, the president tweeted a false story about a U.S. military officer mass murdering prisoners of war by shooting them with bullets dipped in pig's blood, and leading a Republican senator publicly to question whether the president has the stability and competence to succeed. Now, you'll also remember the president fired his chief strategist, Steve Bannon. So where does this administration go from here? Let's talk about it. CNN political commentator and political anchor at Spectrum News, Errol Lewis, joins us, as well as Sarah Westwood, White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
So this has to be the worst vacation that anyone has had this summer. Let's start with you, Errol. And, you know, when the president goes back to the White House, a lot is on the table that has been left undone, a lot to move forward to. I want to put this in the context of what Steve Bannon told the Washington Post. He said that no administration in history has been so divided among itself about the direction, about where it should go. So the question, how much of his agenda remains here, and where does the president start?
Well, there are a lot of different questions that are wrapped up in that one, Victor. The real issue is, look, in the short term, there are some pretty important items like the federal budget, like tax cuts that were promised on the campaign trail that this White House is going to have to deal with. I interpret the Bannon comment, though, as one in part about style. Will it continue to be chaotic? Will the president continue to pit different aides against one another? Will the president continue to tweet and sort of make policy spontaneously and change that policy as the mood hits him? Or will they be a little bit more focused, a little more orderly, and get to some of these big ticket items? And again, things like a possible government shutdown, things like getting the budget passed, that's on a pretty strict timetable. They can't really afford to lose more weeks the way they have over the last 2 weeks.
Of course, most important is that debt ceiling that's coming up pretty soon. Sarah, to you, another pullout from this Washington Post interview with Steve Bannon. If the Republican Party on Capitol Hill gets behind the president on his plans and not theirs, It will all be sweetness and light, Bannon says. One big happy family. But most Americans, though, oppose the big ticket items the president's pushing. Most Americans oppose a wall along the southern border. Most Americans opposed all of the Obamacare repeal and replace plans that came out that the president supported. So sweetness and light.
Well, you know, the president should do everything that he can to implement the agenda that he ran on and got elected on, because then it would be too easy for his critics to say his presidency fell short in all the areas that made him unique. So obviously the president is going to keep pushing for those items, even if they're not polling as well as they used to, given the president's unpopularity. But the problem is that Republicans on Capitol Hill are not going to want to stick their neck out for this president while he's so embattled, while his approval ratings are continuing to plummet. They're not going to want to expend political capital fighting for things that are specific to the Trump agenda, like the border wall, whereas things like repealing and replacing Obamacare, which are Republican plans that long predated President Trump, those are things that Republicans might make progress on in spite of President Trump. But in terms of what is specific to Trump, what Trump champions that Republicans were kind of forced to accept in retrospect because Trump was so popular, those are the kinds of things that could be casualties of Trump's kind of rocky first few months on the job.
Okay, Errol, let me come to you. With all that there is on the table, on Tuesday, President Trump heads to Phoenix for a 2020 re-election rally. I mean, this is, I guess, an opportunity for the president. Can he pass this test, or has he already failed it? What's his opportunity to recover here?
Well, he has an opportunity to recover. I don't know if going to rallies of his base is going to be what gets it done. I mean, there's this peculiar kind of theme that runs through the Steve Bannon comments, both the interview in the Washington Post as well as other recent comments, which is that he somehow imagines that with the president having won a sort of a narrow victory over the Republican establishment, that the Republican establishment is now supposed to disregard all of what, individual members of Congress and senators, supposed to disregard what their constituents want, disregard everything that they themselves stand for and have run on, and simply line up behind a chaotic White House. That's probably not going to happen. So when the president goes to Phoenix, and good for him, it sort of boosts his morale, it energizes his base. It's nice to have the president out in the country and outside of the Beltway. But it's not going to address this fundamental problem of, does he want the establishment? Does he expect the establishment to simply line up behind him? Or is he going to negotiate with them? Is he going to strike one of his famous deals and give a little to get a little?
Finally to you, Sarah, before we go. We're hearing now from Ivanka Trump. I mean, she's back from vacation just like the president, tweeting out about Boston and the demonstrations we saw there yesterday. But she was noticeably silent after the president, his very fine people rant about blame on both sides in Charlottesville. She doesn't seem to be the moderating force that some expected she would be. What's the impact after this last week on her ability to impact and influence her father?
This was some of the highest scrutiny she's received since she joined the administration in this advisory capacity, because a lot of people expected her to come out and sort of denounce her president's comments, and that didn't happen. Ivanka Trump's purpose along the way, since she's been helping her father, seems to be to protect the family brand from some of the more controversial things that her father has said, but that didn't really happen in this case. And there's a question as to why Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump happened to be on vacation when this situation unfolded, and whether Trump's comments was the cause of them being gone or the effect of not being there to moderate President Trump. So there are a lot of questions about why she was so silent this past week, and it is interesting to see her all of a sudden back online when her father is starting to emerge from this controversy.
All right, Sarah Westwood, Errol Lewis, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Governor John Kasich and Congressman Adam Schiff joined Jake Tapper on State of the Union today, 9 Eastern, right here on CNN.
Well, a second officer, we've learned, has died after an overnight shooting in Kissimmee, Florida. Sergeant Richard Sam Howard was shot late Friday night after responding to suspected drug activity and reports of a suicide attempt. Now, he died yesterday afternoon in the hospital. Howard was there to back up Officer Matthew Baxter. Police say there was a scuffle Then the gunfire started, and Baxter died at the scene. Police have charged Everett Glenn Miller with first-degree murder, among other charges.
Well, it's the plane North Korea's Kim Jong-un hates. Coming up, we'll take you to Guam for a closer look at the U.S. Air Force's B-1 bomber.
And President Trump hails Steve Bannon's return to the right-wing website Breitbart, saying, quote, fake news needs the competition. How will Bannon help drive his agenda from outside the White House?
And it's the countdown to the total eclipse that will turn day into night. What do you think's going to happen?
Like, I don't think you really should look at the sun. It might, like,
No, you shouldn't.
burn your eyes.
It is tomorrow, the day the sun will disappear across the U.S. for a brief moment. Day's going to turn to night for the total solar eclipse.
It is. I've already got my stylish glasses.
You're not going to put them on, are you?
Well,
You want mine?
yeah.
Okay, go.
I don't know why this excites me so much.
See, I took a picture of him in them and put them on Instagram. I don't think he was too happy with that picture, so I didn't know if you'd put them back on again.
So here's the fun thing about this, Allison Chinchar. I'm going to tell a secret of yours. You bring these glasses over from the Weather Center. We don't have them, and then you say, give them back right after the shot.
Yeah.
Like we're not even allowed. I don't have anything for the eclipse.
And you need them, and I wish I had more pairs, not to sell them off, but so many people have asked because there really are a lot of places that are now sold out of these. And here's the thing. You know all those people, Victor and Christy, that go out on a cloudy day and end up getting sunburned because they think, oh, it's cloudy, I won't get burned. This is the same issue. Just because your forecast may end up being cloudy doesn't mean you can't use these. You are still going to have to use these even if rain, say, is in the forecast for your eclipse. So speaking of which, let's take a look at the forecast for the areas along the path, okay? First, it's going to start on the west coast of Oregon, namely around Salem. Again, it's going to cross over around 2 o'clock near Kansas City, Missouri, and then just shy of 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. These are all Eastern time, by the way. This is when it's going to pass through areas like Charleston, South Carolina, and then going over the water for the few lucky folks on that cruise. But in terms of the actual forecast, okay, let's take a look at what we've got going on. Here's that totality path. We start out to the west. Actually, for folks in Oregon, say in Idaho, outside of a little bit of haze and smoke from some of those wildfires, the forecast actually remains dry. The cool part about that smoke is that it actually may end up changing some of the colors. You may end up getting more red and orange hints or hues to it because of that smoke and haze. Now, we shift the forecast a little bit further to the east, say, namely around Kansas City and St. Louis. Here's where the problems are, because both of those cities actually have not just potential for showers, but also severe weather tomorrow as well. We're actually talking damaging winds, large hail, and isolated tornadoes. So if you plan to be in the path of totality around these locations, make sure you also have your weather alerts so that you can evacuate if you need to, even around the time of the eclipse. Further down to the south, now we get a little bit closer to, say, Nashville. At the moment, other than just an incredibly small chance late in the day, we're talking tomorrow night, that's when the best chance for rain is. So that means you won't necessarily get rain in Nashville, but you may start to have some of the clouds build up ahead of time during the eclipse. Then we move on to areas of South Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, and Charleston, South Carolina, where unfortunately we also have some rain chances in the forecast there, albeit not very high, but even still, if there's one pop-up shower and thunderstorm in the afternoon during the eclipse and none for the rest of the day, it doesn't matter, because that's the most important time of day to have nice weather. But again, we've talked about it before, Victor and Christy, the most important thing to have are your glasses. There are still some locations that have them. My best advice, maybe check out your local animal shelter. A lot of them are actually giving them away for pets. Still not really sure why, because your animal doesn't normally look at the sun on the normal day, but they have them nonetheless for your pets, so maybe they'll even be able to sneak you an extra pair as well.
All right, good advice there. Allison Chinchar.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, let's turn to these escalating threats now from North Korea. There's a new warning from Kim Jong-un as the U.S. is now preparing for military drills.
Also, thousands of counter-protesters come face-to-face with people affiliated with white supremacist groups. Unlike protests leading up to last week's terror attack, demonstrations were largely peaceful. But there is another protest and rally next week in San Francisco. We're going to talk about police responses in a moment. Your threat from North Korea to tell you about this warning. Pyongyang says it's ready to, quote, mercilessly strike at any time.
Now, this warning comes as the U.S. and South Korea are preparing for joint military drills. And North Korea says those exercises are reckless and bring the two countries to the brink of nuclear war. Despite the threat, the U.S. says the drills will go on as planned.
People united will never be defeated. The people united will never be defeated.
The Charlottesville terror attack is inspiring anti-Nazi and anti-racism protesters to march in streets across the country. Some 2,000 demonstrators paraded from downtown Atlanta to the tomb of Martin Luther King Jr. That happened yesterday. That was just one of several rallies in major cities, including in Dallas, New Orleans, Memphis. Many speaking out against Confederate symbols and monuments, all were largely peaceful, I'm happy to tell you.
And one of the largest protests was in Boston. A self-described free speech rally of about 100 alt-right supporters was dwarfed by thousands of counter-protesters. At one point, the small group of white nationalists was huddled in a gazebo surrounded on all sides by protesters. A lot of them carried signs that read, "Hate speech is not free speech." President Trump tweeted this: "Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston. Police are looking tough and smart. Thank you."
In stark contrast with the president, Boston's mayor and superintendent praised the counter-protesters for remaining peaceful in the face of bigotry.
I want to thank all the people that came out to share that message of love, not hate, to fight back on racism, to fight back on anti-Semitism, to fight back on the white supremacists that were coming to our city.
As you look around, nothing's burning, nothing's stolen, nothing's looted, that the young people of Boston, their parents, their loved ones, and especially the young people of Boston, you know, this is a victory today to stand together and drive away racism.
So while the Boston Police Department is being praised for keeping order, police in Charlottesville are still facing some backlash after a man mowed down dozens of anti-racism protesters. Remember, one woman was killed, but the residents there are criticizing the police as too passive, blasting them for failing to keep apart white nationalists and counter-protesters, not separating them so much. I want to bring in Charles Ramsey, CNN law enforcement analyst and former chief of the Washington and Philadelphia police departments. Charles, thank you so much for being with us. I want to read to you you're welcome. What a counter protester in Charlottesville told the Washington Post after the terror attack last week. 70-year-old David Cooper told them, "The worst part is that people got hurt and the police stood by and didn't do an expletive thing." And then the former Charlottesville chief of police says he has a valid concern. Let's listen together here.
I think the question being raised by the general public is a legitimate one. I mean, clearly we had notice of groups coming into this city with divergent views. I think the potential for violence was real and beyond speculative. I think when they presented themselves Saturday morning in our community with shields, with helmets, with weaponry, I think it was foreseeable that there would be violence.
What's your reaction to the criticism?
Well, I agree with Chief Longo. I mean, that was a situation where you did have a lot of signs that this could potentially turn violent, and they just weren't as prepared as they could have been. But in fairness to Charlottesville, they're probably a department that's not accustomed to handling large demonstrations, particularly those that have a high potential for violence. So they need to reach out and learn from some of the larger jurisdictions like Boston, New Orleans, Philly, D.C., that handle these kinds of things on a fairly regular basis.
And it's safe to say Boston learned from watching Charlotte. Would that be safe to say?
Well, it is safe to say it. Obviously, you saw that it's no longer a potential for violence, but actual violence can occur, including a murder that took place. So, you know, that gives you a good heads up. But Boston is very adept at handling these kinds of things anyway, and they've got a large department, and they had an overwhelming presence, and that's really what you want.
The president tweeted, Victor just read it a minute ago, but I want to reiterate it here for folks who might have missed it. The president tweeted, "Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston. Police are looking tough and smart. Thank you." How do President Trump's words affect law enforcement, whether it's psychological, whether it's how they implement their planning?
it doesn't have any real effect on us one way or the other. You know, I mean, like everyone else, you get confused because that's the first tweet followed by two others that were totally different and really is what you would have expected from a president. So when you're in the planning stages, you're focused on one thing and one thing only. Allow people to exercise their First Amendment rights on both sides, but at the same time, keep people safe from harm. That's your focus, not what a president or anyone else is really saying at the moment.
Real quickly, there's a free speech rally in San Francisco next weekend. The risk is that you just don't know who's going to show up. Is that right? What are your feelings about what's upcoming?
Well, I mean, you have to deal with all these things individually, but I do think the success in Boston, and when you look elsewhere, you know, we didn't have the kind of violence we saw in Charlottesville. Police chiefs do communicate with one another. Their tactical people communicate with one another. The Joint Terrorism Task Force, their own intel divisions will be monitoring some of the websites to see what kind of talk is going on there so you can be prepared. But certainly Charlottesville was a wake-up call for everybody.
All righty. Charles Ramsey, we so appreciate your time. Thank you.
That's okay. Thank you.
President Trump seems to be counting on Steve Bannon as an ally, despite cutting him loose at the White House. Bannon returned to Breitbart News to run it on the same day he was fired from his job from the administration. Joining us now to talk about what to expect, Brian Stelter, CNN senior media correspondent and host of Reliable Sources. Brian, good morning to you.
Hey, good morning. Really interesting to see the president weighing in one day after Steve Bannon's departure from the White House, posting a message on Twitter that seemed like he was trying to send off Bannon with a fond farewell, even though there have been tensions between the two men. Here's what the president wrote, his most recent message about Bannon. He said, Bannon will be a tough and smart new voice at Breitbart News, maybe even better than ever before. Fake news needs the competition. So you see President Trump here trying to send off Bannon with a positive message one day after Bannon, of course, left on a not so positive note. It was described as a firing, and Bannon, in his own words, had some interesting comments about the president, saying that the Trump presidency we fought for, this disruptive presidency, is now over. Here's part of what Bannon told the Weekly Standard. He said on the outside he'll be able to fight for Trump more now. This is sort of spin, I think, but Bannon said, I can fight better on the outside. I can't fight too many Democrats on the inside like I can on the outside. This is the beginning of what's going to be a really interesting period, Victor, to have Trump's chief strategist now on the outside at Breitbart without being in the White House anymore.
All right, we'll watch that. Brian Stelter, thanks so much.
Thanks.
Well, the man who inspired the movie American History X is with us. As hate groups gain traction in the U.S., we're going to ask this former neo-Nazi, can they be stopped?
And we look back at the life of the pioneering comedian and civil rights activist Dick Gregory, who died Saturday at the age of 84.
100 alt-right supporters show up to rally in Boston. They're dwarfed by thousands of counter-protesters, but the rally, it was primarily peaceful. Not so, obviously, in Charlottesville last weekend, as you remember. Counter-protesters tried to fight the hate groups. So some people might be wondering, which is the better strategy to stop the rise of white supremacists? You may remember the 1998 movie American History X. It's about a neo-Nazi who went to prison, faced his ignorance, and turned his back on his past. Well, our next guest is the man who inspired that movie. We are joined now by Frank Mink, a former neo-Nazi recruiter. Frank, thank you so much for being with us. Also the author of Autobiography of a Recovering Skinhead. I think people are watching this, and the first thing they want to know, Frank, is what enticed you to become a neo-Nazi?
You know, I felt marginalized. I felt that people couldn't be there for me when I needed them, my family, and I went to an all-black school. I was fist fighting a lot with the kids at school. So there was little tensions there. You know, I was full of fear. I was a kid that was afraid of my school. I was afraid of my parents who weren't around, step-parents. I was afraid I wasn't going to have enough food to eat today. We were kind of poor. We were on the poor side of Philadelphia, and so I felt marginalized.
So you felt marginalized, and just to clarify, did you truly feel superior as a white man, or was it primarily fear-driven?
It's all fear-driven. Every guy that you see, yes, the 100 pro-white people that were there, they're all full of fear. These are fear and guys who are full of anger and fear that join these groups. It's what they're about.
But what is the fear? What is the fear about? What do they fear? What did you fear?
Well, you know, I feared basically going to school some days, but I mean, other people fear that they're going to lose what's theirs. That's what this is all about. They feel that What they had is now being taken by other people, minorities. So, you know, they see affirmative action as a threat to them. I mean, it's really not. You know, reality. You see, sometimes your feelings aren't facts, and these guys feel that these are real. That they're losing their jobs because of affirmative action, and so this is what they wake up and they think about. First thing when they wake up in the morning is they think about that.
You wrote a couple of years ago in an interview, you had said, our violence was our camaraderie, a clockwork orange. Was that the glue that held you all together? Was the camaraderie of violence against somebody else?
Absolutely. It was, we would go out, like, as normal teenagers, you go out and you shoot basketball or you shoot hockey pucks with your friends. We didn't do that. We went out and we practiced race stuff for a race war. And we come back and we learn, when we used to go out and practice stuff, race war stuff and violence, we go back to the tents that we would live in Pennsylvania, where we go for our Bible studies. And they would teach us that everything we're doing is by God's hand. God wants us to fight for the white race. God has chosen us to be the angels that ruined Sodom and Gomorrah. You're telling a welfare kid from Philadelphia that God wants me on his team? Like, that was our camaraderie.
So what changed for you when you were in prison? What turned you around?
You know, I was a young kid. I was 17 in an adult maximum security prison. One of the first prisons I go to is John Wayne Gacy's still there. I mean, that's how long ago it was. But I go there, and the other kids that played sports, I went to play sports. I was an athlete. I grew up my whole life playing sports. Were all these other young black kids from Chicago. And so sometimes I would get a chance to go play with them, even though I was this neo-Nazi with a swastika on my neck. I happened to know a couple of the kids from working in Chow Hall, and I got to start playing football with some of them. And then they seen that I was good, and those guys used to start. You know, when you play sports with guys, you start walking back from the yard back to your cells. We talk about life because we're 17-year-old kids in adult prison. And we talk about our girlfriends and who had a baby on the way. And we talked about, because I had a baby on the way. And we just start to get to know each other to where they knew more about me than my own Aryan gang in prison. These guys knew more about my life. And so when I got out of prison, there was this, I couldn't get a job. I was aggravated kidnapping on my record. I got a swastika on my neck. These ain't good people skills. And a Jewish guy gives me a job doing antique furniture. And he was a man who just didn't care what my beliefs were at first. He just said, I don't care, as long as you don't break my furniture, you can work for me.
So
and I worked for this guy. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just wanted, we only have a couple seconds, but I wanted to really get something, you know, even more productive out of this. What would you say to people who are in these neo-Nazi gangs right now and who may be feeling that fear? What would you say to them? How can you take what happened to you in prison and what changed you and move it into the outside world and hope that it changes somebody else? How do they do that when they are where they are?
Well, I mean, you got to, if they want to be a better human being, but I can't change them in a soundbite neither, though, as you understand. You have to find out who the human being is. You have to treat them as human beings. When I used to walk in these marches, when I used to be one of the bad guys in these marches, people throw bottles at me. I never ducked a bottle and thought, whoa, I better change my beliefs here. No, now I'm more for what I'm standing for. I need people to talk to me as a human being. I need for me you to have a conversation, and that's where people start to change. Not throwing bottles, not break. You want to protest racism? Go protest the private prison industry. That's real racism. Protest the stop and frisk. That's real racism. That's where you really start.
And are you able to talk to any of these neo-Nazis now? I mean, do they talk to you? Do they ask for your advice? Do you see hope in what you see, in what we saw in Charlottesville, that change can happen?
Change can always happen for a human being, and it will happen. Look, the alt-right, it's just renamed. All the other racist groups you've gone over through history, they're just rebranding right now, and it's always going to come to an end, and it's going to be a violent end probably, maybe an Oklahoma City bombing. I hope not, because what we need to all remember, and please, before you cut me off, we got to remember the end result of this is a fireman running down the street with a dead little girl in his hands, and that's Oklahoma City bombing. That's what you got to images. We got to remember. This is where we got to stop this from going, because humanity will always win in the end, always win. But they're going to be on the wrong side of history again. But how long is it going to take us to get there? I don't know, and I hope that we could all help it happen without the violence.
You are a great voice for this, Frank. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and helping us understand a little bit more about how these things take shape. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
Important conversation there. He broke through the color barrier, became an iconic comedian, and went on to fight for equal rights. This morning, we remember the life of Dick Gregory.
I feel so sorry for Willie. I hate to see any baseball player having troubles, because that's a great sport for my people. That is the only sport in the world where a Negro can shake a stick at a white man and won't start no riot.
In the 60s, Gregory was one of the early black performers to headline in white comedy clubs. He got his big break in 1961 when the prestigious Playboy Club in Chicago asked him to fill in one night. The club then went on to offer him a 3-year contract. And when he was not making people laugh, he was a voice for justice.
We black folks is the only people in the history of the planet that went through what we went through and opt for education over liberation. George Washington didn't beat up the...
Gregory marched for civil rights, wrote several books, including Murder in Memphis, which analyzed the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He also adamantly opposed the Vietnam War. Now, Gregory recently had to reschedule an event in Atlanta after getting sick. His family says that he died at a hospital in Washington Saturday night. He was 84 years old. Reverend Jesse Jackson memorialized him on Twitter, saying this: "He taught us how to laugh. He taught us how to fight. He taught us how to live." Dick Gregory was committed to justice. I miss him already.
Thoughts and prayers to his family, for sure. Well, it is the prime reason that Kim Jong-un sees Guam as a threat. The B-1 bomber. Next, drills beginning on the Korean Peninsula. We're taking you to Guam for a look at one of the most important... Well, we are just hours away from the United States and South Korea starting joint military drills off the Korean Peninsula. But before they begin, North Korea is already warning the countries that it sees those exercises as, quote, reckless. And North Korea threatening that it can strike the U.S. at any moment. Pyongyang says the planned drills bring the U.S. and North Korea to the, quote, brink of nuclear war.
Well, it is a massive bomber that flies like a jet. And the U.S. and South Korea military drill that's starting tomorrow is going to use them. The B-1 bomber, more important than ever. I hear CNN correspondent Martin Savage in Guam.
It's the plane that Kim Jong-un hates, flying from the base that has put the U.S. territory of Guam at the top of North Korea's hit list. We were given a close-up look at both. Andersen Air Force Base on the northern end of the island of Guam has been around since World War II, but increasingly it's taking on a key strategic role for possible military action against North Korea.
We train every day. We are always our readiness, and that's what makes us ready to fight tonight, because we have this power projection here right behind us.
As the U.S. grows more and more concerned with the possibility of North Korea launching a nuclear missile, this base and its bombers are called the tip of the spear for their ability to launch preemptive strikes on North Korean missile sites if so ordered. B-1 bombers, usually working in pairs, have been making the 2,100-mile flight from Guam to the Korean Peninsula, a mission of about 10 hours. The Air Force calls the flights routine. You could also call them something else: practice.
So the pilots that fly the B-1 bombers say it's really like flying a fighter jet, not a heavy-lift bomber. And they cite 3 words: speed, persistence, it can linger a long time, and payload.
In Iraq and Afghanistan, the B-1 has been a workhorse capable of remaining airborne for long periods of time, just waiting for the right moment to strike.
This is what gives the plane its incredible, lethal punch. This is actually the bomb rack here. And if you look carefully, you notice that it rotates like a carousel. It allows this aircraft to carry all kinds of different munitions. That way, it can carry out multiple strikes on the same flight.
The B-1 has multiple capabilities. Obviously, it's a bomber, so it carries bombs. It has gravity bombs. It has GPS-guided bombs. It also has standoff bombs. So we don't necessarily have to get directly over the target to drop.
Just out of sight of the flight line's another feature of the base that makes it such a potential threat: a massive series of bunkers storing millions of pounds of conventional bombs and explosives, including 2,000-pound bunker busters that can be used to target North Korea's regime. Kim Jong-un may have backed off any immediate plans to fire missiles at Guam, but airmen say nothing has changed at Andersen. Here, commanders say both the base and the bombers are prepared to carry out whatever, whenever the president orders, living up to its motto: ready to fight tonight. Martin Savage, CNN, Andersen Air Force Base, Guam.
The USS Indianapolis, lost since World War II, has been found, get this, in 18,000 feet of water. A team of civilian researchers found it Friday, and they were led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. It was torpedoed by the Japanese in 1945. while returning from a secret mission delivering parts for the atom bomb. Almost 1,200 men were stranded in the water. Now, if this story sounds familiar, you might remember the ship from one of the most chilling scenes in the movie, Jaws, when shark hunter Quint talks about it, this nightmare that he had about World War II.
On Thursday morning, Chief, I bumped into a friend of mine, Herbie Robinson from Cleveland. Baseball player, bosun's mate. I thought he was asleep. Reached over to wake him up. Bobbed up and down in the water. It was like a kind of top. Upended. Well, he'd been bitten in half below the waist.
Well, a lot of that story